Welcome everybody to the Future of Place session on precincts. I'm going to hand over now to Ian Hatton. He is the Regional Manager for Queensland and in the Northern Territory for AnyHub. Ian, thank you so much for joining. I'm going to mute myself now and hand over to you, and or please feel free to drop your questions in the chat box and we'll get to them afterwards. Take it away, Ian.
What I'm going to talk about today is, as Robin said, that the relationship between data and people and place, and how data can improve the design of places, the operation of places, and the aesthetic of places. I'm going to look at a few different components. The first one being the visitor experience, which a visitor for me is not just a holiday maker, but somebody who goes to a high street to go shopping, or somebody who goes to a park. They're visitors to that location because they're not at home. So I've kind of used that in a fairly loose sense. And then I'm going to talk about capturing data and then using that data to inform the future. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about the 2032 Brisbane Olympics, which I think is a topic of a lot of discussion, but a very salient version of what we're talking about today. So the visitor experience is extremely complex and covers lots of different things. And if you think, people generally go somewhere because they want to have an experience or access a service, or they want to buy something. The way they do that needs to be as easy as possible. And particularly if you're talking about a Brisbane Olympics context, where you're going to get millions of people traveling from overseas, many of whom won't have English as a first language, the complexity of providing information is there. And then, of course, each time people go anywhere these days, they share their experiences on social media. So we've got to be very aware of people's experience when they come to a place, or they visit a place, or they try to do something, that they'll be very quick to let everybody know if it was a bad experience, and hopefully they'll also be equally quick to share good experiences. And from a tourism perspective, that's obviously a significant component of marketing and brand. So if we just take that point of social media, a few years ago, in one of the tourism surveys by Tourism Research Australia, the fourth most complained about thing in Australia by overseas visitors was poor public Wi-Fi. So if you think of an American visitor where public Wi-Fi is quite mature, they come here, they don't want to pay roaming charges, they want to still interact with family and friends. The Wi-Fi experience wasn't good. At the same time, we're seeing an evolution from 4G to 5G, and as I'm sure a lot of people know, there's a direct correlation that 5G has lower latency, greater bandwidth, but shorter range, which means there's going to be more antennas in the public realm providing those services to people, and obviously precincts are critically important. Digital messaging, going back to that wayfinding point, I think a lot of people now use Google Maps, or they use interpretation tools and navigation tools. So the traditional street sign potentially has a different role, and particularly for a temporary overlay for a games, it's clearly needs to be thought about differently. Digital displays becoming more and more common in the public realm, sometimes a bit controversially with the size of some of the advertising hoardings and digital display screens, and digital wayfinding, as I've said. So when you put all of these together, there's actually an increasing demand for communications in the public realm, which creates data. And in the second part of this presentation, I'll talk about some of that data. Also in the public realm, there are a bunch of things that people expect. So as we see an increase in people transacting and doing things at different times of day, public lighting, CCTV, all of the typical public realm infrastructure becomes increasingly significant. One of the things that I find is, with the introduction of micromobility, and I'll talk a bit about this, there are a number of new conflicts in the road reserve. So the central area is generally dedicated to cars and buses. That's been the case for a long time. And the footpath is shared between wheelchair users, people with prams and pushchairs, pedestrians, micromobility, et cetera, et cetera. So there's, in some ways, in highly trafficked urban areas, there's potentially a need to review and revise, and I'll talk a bit about how data can influence this. but to change that relationship between 75% of the space being for cars and then having an extremely congested footpath, which of course is the footpath is the front door to shops and businesses. So there's a whole load of things around safety in the public realm that I think are rapidly changing, and there are opportunities to use data to make some change. So I've talked a bit about this. The whole essence of mobility is changing, and depending on who you speak to, we're going to have fully autonomous fleets in a decade, which will obviously change things again. But the critical thing I see quite a lot of is that transition between modes of transport. So you'll see people potentially go and park somewhere, jump on a tram, and then use a scooter or something to get to their final point of destination. So the complexity of transport, coupled with increasing demand, and then overlaying something like an Olympics where more and more people are going to visit a concentrated area, means the design and function of precincts and places probably needs to change. So in terms of the data, there are many ways, obviously, of gathering data. Traditionally, I've worked in tourism before, and a lot of the analysis, I suppose, is done by survey. So what will quite often happen is at the airport, somebody will get a survey asking them about the 2 weeks they spent in Australia and how was your holiday. And generally, most of us can only remember a few things, highlights, lowlights, but it's not helping necessarily inform at the precinct level or the service offering level a lot. Social media, sentiment analysis and things like that are good, but again, there are some skewing factors around people who have a particularly good or a particularly bad experience are more inclined to post on social media and use emotive language. And then the really complex component of journey mapping. So in a former council role, we were looking at customer journey mapping for somebody going from a car park to a beach, and they cross about 7 or 8 different council departments, each of whom have their own priorities and their own budgets. But the customer or the user experience is not defined or designed from that end-to-end point of consumption. So it becomes really, really difficult to design and manage precincts. So at the basic form, we already have a lot of this, excuse me, a lot of this data. So, vacancy rates, leasing, car park occupation, et cetera, are all largely part of planning scheme monitoring and standard operations for council. Increasingly, IoT data around weather and footfall counts and things like that are being incorporated. But I've found that there's still a lot of complexity in that IoT data. Even in terms of pedestrian counting, the difference in accuracy between the different technologies means there's a different cost profile, different complexity profile, which means that not all services are the same, and a lot of the time people consuming the data potentially aren't clear about what the use case is for that data. So they may be paying too much, or they may be not getting enough information. So there's a whole lot of built form analysis that I think is currently below where it needs to be, and there's a significant opportunity to use that data differently. Movement analysis is, to my mind, the biggest opportunity available for precincts. Origin and destination, there are companies like DSpark that do really good origin and destination analysis using telecommunications data. So they use the Optus network. You can use Bluetooth sniffers to do heat mapping, trend analysis, seasonality, time of day, all of that sort of thing. And then all these other sources of data that are becoming more and more prevalent. And if brought together, you could build a really interesting pattern of who goes to a place, how long do they spend there, where do they go when they leave that place, and fully anonymized. You don't need to know anything about any individual. You just know that there are numbers of people coming in at different times of day, and of those, a percentage will go somewhere else afterwards. So you'd expect people going to a restaurant precinct will probably go to a bar as well. So you can start to think about some of the form and function of that place based on the number of people, the time of day, and the types of use. What those previous couple of slides have highlighted is that data, that data just doesn't reside in one single place. And one of the things I've found over the last few years working in smart cities is a lot of the data that people want to collect often exists in some form, but it's not in very good condition. It's not very reliable. It's being held by a company or an organization, and there's a concern about sharing that because of the implications commercially or otherwise. There are issues around sensitivity of data, privacy and legislation around things that can enable you to identify people, identify things that are inappropriate. The whole idea of, having clear ethical statements about why you're collecting data, what you're going to use it for, and how people will benefit is an emerging industry, if you like. And then, of course, business data is generally commercially sensitive. So people who have spent time and money and invested in generating an understanding of their client base is unlikely to share that with a competitor, and will be reluctant generally to make that available because there's implications there again. So data sharing, I think, is essential, but there's no doubt it is extremely complex. So if we take all of those things, all I've really done is summarize a whole bunch of considerations. So what I want to talk about now is some of the things that could be done, and I think could be done really quite simply if there was a will. And then I'm going to talk a bit about how the Olympics provides that opportunity to bring some of those things to action. So in terms of the user experience, pretty simply, what do people like and not like, and how do you do less of what they don't like and more of what they do? And then how do you compare that between places? And what would you do differently? And the road reserve one is one that I'll talk about. So back to the built form, town planning policies around awning, planting, cooling, prevailing breeze, orientation. There's a lot of sophistication there, but in my experience, a real opportunity for different jurisdictions, different planning authorities to share data and to look at, in this location, we took this action and it had an impact of a certain kind. How can that be applied elsewhere? And then you get those communities of practice, and you start to build that into some larger, modelling tools and things like that. Can really, I think, particularly in a climate like Australia's, can really start to help some of that, public realm comfort type things, as well as safety and other things. Transport planning and design codes. I've touched on road reserves. I personally think there needs to be a radical shift in how precincts and high streets and those sorts of multimodal locations are designed. And obviously, huge investment nationally in public transport, huge investment in green technology, et cetera, but it feels to me that there's a lack of thinking about the actual physical allocation of space for those different uses. And we've all seen, anyone who's ridden a bike, you've got a bike lane here, you'll get to an intersection, there's no bike lane, and then for 100 metres, you're fighting it out with buses and cars, and then you're back on a cycle lane. And that causes not only danger, but frustration for motorists, frustrations for cyclists, etc. So, as I say, that space allocation, if informed by data, and we move away from the traditional, we've always put bike lanes here and there's no space there, and we don't want to lose any car capacity. The data can help inform a discussion around that to get a better outcome. Underground assets is an extremely challenging thing in urban areas, and we've all had that experience of, something gets dug up, put back, and somebody else comes along and digs it up. And you quite often find that when you're trying to lay telecommunications networks, for example, 5G and in the future 6G will need fibre to as close to the end user as possible. There's multiple asset owners. There's a reluctance for government to share some of its infrastructure with the private sector, but a kind of a really great opportunity to look at all the underground assets and see where there's opportunities to rationalise and combine and share and get a better outcome. And telecommunications fundamentally, I think, is going to be a great way to generate more information about what's going on. As I said, that DSpark model of, analysing anonymous information about numbers of people and movement patterns is extremely valuable for understanding the built form and how much space needs to be allocated to different uses. car parking, parks, open space, etc. Movement analytics I've talked a bit about, but it's kind of, if you go back to that customer journey mapping, generally people want to go from a place to a place to do something, and they'll go back to where they started because it will be from home. So you're either going to work or school or to the shops or going on holiday, which you're away for longer. But it's, the data around where there are, increasing demand or demand that outstrips the capacity of the asset, or where there's, an allocation of space to a use that could be allocated to something else which would give a benefit. What modes of transport? So I live on the Gold Coast. North-south connections through light rail and roads are really good. East-west connections, not so much. But there's, to my mind, a fantastic opportunity to just start analysing in more detail, where do people come from? How do they access transport? Where are they going? How do you connect up those east-west bus routes? How do you get more micro-mobility? Whatever the solution might be, there's a whole load of value in changing the design of transport networks based on data. And we're back to data sharing. I was involved in the Commonwealth Games in 2018, and I think similarly to G20, there were some great examples of the police, council, transport and others combining information through their GIS systems and their management systems and security. But then after the games, that stopped because the underlying need to do that was gone. But if we go back to getting better form and function for public spaces and precincts, then I believe that demand is still there. Digital twins, great opportunity to bring data together. Common topic of discussion now, and I think combined with building information management and other systems, they will fundamentally change the way things are designed. And smart infrastructure data sharing agreements, I've already touched on. Very complex to share data, but I think if there's a will, there's a way. And now a couple of very quick examples. Brisbane's a series of neighbourhoods. So for the games, it's likely to be a series of precincts. And by using data and information to understand the catchment for a sports precinct or a catchment for something else, and where visitors are likely to go, where they want to spend time and money, I think will be crucially important to the success of the games. These questions are kind of blindingly obvious, but I think that the design around the precincts for a major sporting event, there's assumptions and experience and information and data that go into them. But I think asking these fundamental questions and backing up with data, I have no doubt will help inform logistics, safety, crowd management, retail, commercial benefit. How do you get people to stay longer in a precinct, to spend more money and things like that? So the opportunity for the Olympics is to start to ask these questions now, link that into ticketing and some of those other things that I listed out earlier, to get a better understanding of how do you give the best experience to people, how do you have the best infrastructure and overlay, and how do you get the best economic and community benefit from the hosting of the games. And then this is something I have a personal interest in. I just find it fascinating how fan zones can give people the experience of being in a stadium, but they can be on the other side of the country. It could be in Perth doing this. But I would imagine around southeast Queensland and probably the rest of Queensland, there'll be a number of these venues. Now, if you were to take a data-based approach to this, how would you locate it? How would you choose a location? Near transport, near power, near comms, available land, government-owned land. There's a whole load of things that generally get done, but again, there's a whole overlay around catchment, origin and destination, boundary perimeter, et cetera, that can be done better with data. Then there's the ticketing, licensing and control and compliance side of things. How do you also use apps, for example, to measure where people go and to incentivize people to not all leave at the same time and create congestion around public transport nodes. So plenty of lessons there. And then the thing that I saw with the Commonwealth Games, and I think is true of most of these things, is a couple of years before the event, legacy gets kind of left a little bit to one side because everyone's concerned about hosting the event and doing a great job. So the legacy of a fan zone or an overlay for a precinct should be that that location has a better form and function for communities into the future. And a very quick one on high streets, same questions. But again, we've got all of these competing interests of, how do you get in? How do you move around? Clutter, congestion, signage, back to that multi-language signage, connectivity. If you're putting IoT things all over the place, very quickly the public realm can be impacted both aesthetically and functionally. And I think there is an opportunity to use data and information to just rethink the way we design public realm and high streets to maximize retail opportunities, but also, to make them safe, welcoming, friendly. All of those things are, there's very clever people who design things and architects, but I have no doubt that having more information and data about, the kinds of times of day and the use patterns and the dwell and those sorts of things are intrinsically important to the future operations. So just in conclusion, my personal view, and certainly AnyHub's view, is data contains the answers. But it's the use of the data which will extract the value. And I think that's the challenge, is to collect, store, use, and share the right data, but then to analyze it and to ask some difficult questions of ourselves about how we design and operate public places and precincts. And thank you. Again, apologies for being late. I've sort of rattled through that a bit to try to catch it back up.
Thanks, Ian. I don't think it's your fault. I think it's probably our calendar setup, and like you said, the daylight savings. There were a couple of people that joined now, so for anyone that joined a little bit later on, we did record the session, and it will be available afterwards. I'll share it on YouTube, LinkedIn, and send an email around. I think let's open up the questions if anyone wants to pop anything in the meeting chat or turn the camera on and ask a question.
Hi, Ian. Thank you for that conversation. You raised a really interesting discussion about predicating the use of data about from a retail perspective. How do we balance the citizens' experience, which may be contrary to the, I suppose, from the retail's perspective, as well as issues around people's concerns about being monetized?
Yeah, I think this comes down to the purpose of collecting and using the data. So I've done a bit of work over the years trying to understand the value of public space and high streets as a community asset. So recently done some work in Western Sydney, hugely diverse cultural backgrounds to the population, and a lot of that public realm is just a gathering space. So I think it's about understanding the people who use it and the reason they're using it. So everything's not just about retail analytics and footfall conversion and as you say, monetizing people. I think the data has to be used to design the place that if a group of people want to gather and socialize, then that's possible as well. So I think there's a delicate balance here between not trying to drive everything through a commercial lens. And I think when you look at Commonwealth Games or Olympics or precinct management generally, that point I sort of skipped over a little bit in one of the slides, talked about civic pride. And I think that data needs to inform what makes people proud of their community or their assets or their parks or whatever, and how do you design them to foster that. Because even if you go back to basic things like natural surveillance, having local people standing on the street and socializing creates that safer environment. So I think, bit of a long-winded answer. I think it comes down to making sure that the purpose is to make the place functional for a diverse range of uses, not just as a retail precinct.
Thanks for that. Sorry, I'm just finishing lunch, so I don't know what's my attitude.
Hi, Ian.
Hi, Belinda.
I am quite interested in your comment about the importance of ethical statements about why you're collecting the data and what you're going to use it for. Can you give me any good examples of one that I might look at, or where this has been done well?
Yeah, there's a few companies that specialise in it. I mean, I used to work at Gold Coast Council. We were doing a lot of people analytics, and we collaborated to develop some products that are now used by Tourism Events Queensland, for example. We worked with DSpark, so they're a good reference point. But if you look on the City of Gold Coast website, there should still be there an ethical statement we published, which had about 6 points on there that provided an upfront statement of, we're going to undertake these activities, these are the reasons we're doing it, these are the benefits, and effectively these are the things we won't do. And we did that for two reasons. One was to be open and transparent that we were doing something, and if there was a strong sentiment that we shouldn't be doing it, then that was good intel. But also to make sure there's a reference point. If anyone was concerned, we could have a conversation about, well, you know, these are the benefits and this is how we're going about it. So that bit of work at Gold Coast is, in my opinion, is one of the more succinct and usable ways of doing this. Otherwise, we spent a lot of time trying not to be too subjective about it. There was a community and economic reason we were doing it. We were doing everything within the law. We're doing everything with an intent and a purpose, and we weren't going to be sharing that and doing all kinds of other crazy stuff with the information.
Thanks, that's really helpful. I work in higher education, and we've had quite a lot of pushback in the past from people about data being collected. Not a lot of trust in the anonymization of data.
Yeah, and that trust component is central to all of this. There is a lack of trust, and I think that's why things like the Olympics are good, because most people can rally around some data sharing or collection to deliver something like that, which changes the focus of the debate a little. So that's why I think it's such a good opportunity. But I think you're right, that trust is is very hard.
Thank you.
There's another question here in the chat from Marcus. Is there a provider you're familiar with which is counting end of journey facilities for cyclists across the country?
No, not that I'm aware of, but somebody should be doing it, because that's a good source of information. Yeah.
We can definitely socialize that question. And then another question here. Have you experienced overspend or overkill on precincts in legacy mode, and how has this been dealt with?
So I assume this means legacy from the Commonwealth Games. I don't think there was overkill or overspend. I think the shame was too much of the focus was on the temporary overlay, not combining the capital works program, the future planned improvements with the overlay requirements and making the place better in the long term. So I think there's a lot of temporary beautification, temporary installation, but then when you take it all away, you've still got the same thing as you had before to a large degree. So yeah, I think there was some missed opportunities there in terms of combining that kind of temporary with the permanent.
Yeah, good point. Any other questions from the chat? No. Okay, well, I think then I think we can wrap up a little bit early. I'll be sending out the recording of the session, as well as perhaps a link to Ian's LinkedIn profile or your email address if you're comfortable with that, Ian. And if you do have questions post the session, you're welcome to then reach out to him. And I'll also add that information to the recording for anyone else that couldn't make it. Let me just check what else we needed to run through. So this, as I mentioned, is the last session for the year, but we are in the process of, we've just put out opened the expression of interests for our 2023 task forces. There are 10 at the moment outlined, and future places is certainly one of those. We'll be revising our Smart Places code, which is a combination of the Code for Smart Communities, which was written a couple of years back, and the Future of Place framework to develop a Smart Places code. So we're really excited about that. If anyone's interested in taking part, definitely reach out to us. And I'll share the link for our Task Force EOIs as well after this. And then we're looking forward to continuing the conversations of this webinar series at the 2023 Australian Smart Cities Week, which will be held in Melbourne at Swinburne University. So do look out for tickets to that as well. A big 2023 planned for all of us across the Smart Cities community. So we look forward to hopefully meeting in person, otherwise many more online meetings and a lot of action and impact in the coming year. Thank you all so much for joining.